Nearly 50 years ago with the 1974 murder of a Texas woman named Carla Walker, who was kidnapped outside of a bowling alley. Now, her case went cold for decades, and just like thousands of other murders all across the country.
Curley switched his plea to guilty for kidnapping and killing Carla Walker back in 1974. Adriana de Alba has the emotional reaction from her family.
In early 1974, Fort Worth and the neighboring town of Benbrook still felt like the kind of place where danger seemed far away. Families left doors unlocked, teenagers gathered freely after school dances, and the community carried an unspoken belief that bad things happened somewhere else, never here. But everything changed on the night of February 16th, when 17-year-old Carla Jan Walker left her high school Valentine's dance and stepped into a nightmare that would haunt the town for half a century. Carla had spent the afternoon getting ready with her mother, Doris Walker, who carefully helped her fix the light blue dress she had been so excited to wear. Her father, Leighton Walker, watched proudly as Carla's boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, arrived at the front door. Rodney, the senior quarterback at Western Hills High School, nervously pinned a small corsage onto Carla's dress. The couple took photos in the living room before heading out to the dance, laughing, whispering plans about college, and thinking only about the future. They danced for hours, surrounded by classmates who later said Carla never stopped smiling that night. After the dance ended, Rodney and Carla drove around with friends, stopping at the usual teen hangouts before dropping everyone off. For them, the night was perfect. Quiet, private, full of possibility. Just before 1 a.m., they pulled into the parking lot of Brunswick Ridge Le Bowl, a place where countless young couples had sat before, feeling safe beneath the dim glow of the building's lights. Rodney later recalled those final moments of peace in vivid detail. Carla had just come back from the restroom. They sat together in the front seat, talking softly. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing hinted at what was coming. Then, without warning, the passenger door flew open. Rodney only saw a flash, a tall figure, a gun, a shadow in the darkness. Before he could react, the stranger brought the butt of the .22 pistol down onto Rodney's head. The first strike blurred his vision. The second made everything spin. As the stranger kept hitting him, Rodney heard Carla begging him to stop. She screamed that she would go with the man if he would just stop hurting Rodney. That was the last thing Rodney remembered before everything went black. Minutes later, bleeding, disoriented, and barely conscious, Rodney stumbled out of his car. Somehow, through instinct alone, he drove through Benbrook's quiet streets until he reached the Walker home on Williams Road. The house was still lit. Inside, Carla's siblings, Jim and Cindy Walker, were awake. Their parents were in the dining room playing dominoes with relatives. When Rodney collided with the curb outside and began pounding frantically on the door, the Walkers opened it to find him covered in blood, shaking uncontrollably. "Mr. Walker, they got her. They took Carla," he pleaded, his voice cracking. Leighton didn't hesitate. He grabbed his pistol and sped back toward the bowling alley. But when he reached the parking lot, the only signs of Carla were her abandoned purse and a Ruger magazine clip lying on the pavement. The search began immediately. Officers from Fort Worth Police Department and Tarrant County Sheriff's Office joined with neighbors who refused to go home. Helicopters circled overhead at dawn. Volunteers walked fields and drainage tunnels. Teachers, classmates, and local church members carried flashlights through the cold morning as word spread that Carla Walker was missing. Still, they found nothing. 2 days passed. Then, on February 20th, 2 officers driving near Lake Benbrook stopped beside a culvert and looked inside. What they saw there would forever change the spirit of their town. Carla lay on her back in her blue dress, her body showing the signs of torture, assault, and violent strangulation. Toxicology reports later showed she had been injected with morphine, and the medical examiner determined she had been kept alive for nearly 2 days before being murdered. The news hit Fort Worth like a shock wave. Fear, anger, disbelief. Each emotion spread through neighborhoods that once felt untouchable. At Carla's funeral, more than 1,200 mourners gathered, far more than the church could hold. Students cried openly. Teachers held each other. Even people who had never met Carla stood outside with candles, grieving for a girl who had become the face of a nightmare no one could understand. But none felt the loss as sharply as her little brother, Jim Walker. At just 12 years old, Jim watched his family unravel. He saw his father pacing, night after night, studying maps and scribbling names of suspects in a small metal box. He saw his mother sit quietly in Carla's room long after everyone else had gone to sleep. And he saw Rodney, a boy who loved Carla deeply, break under the weight of being blamed by classmates and neighbors who couldn't believe a stranger could commit such a crime. Rodney stayed in Carla's room for days after the funeral, sleeping in her bed as if staying near her could somehow shield him from the guilt he carried. But the whispering from the community eventually pushed him to leave Fort Worth altogether. After graduation, he moved to Alaska, hoping distance could quiet memories he couldn't bear to relive. Meanwhile, police tore through every possible lead. Detectives studied photographs from the dance, interviewing anyone who stood near the couple. They hired a hypnotist to help Rodney recall details through the fog of his injuries. They investigated carnival workers, drug dealers, local bowlers, even a man who claimed, falsely, to have killed Carla. That confession led nowhere. At one point, police even questioned Glenn Samuel McCurley, a 31-year-old truck driver who owned a Ruger pistol that matched the magazine clip dropped in the parking lot. But McCurley told detectives the gun had been stolen. He passed a polygraph. And just like that, he was crossed off the suspect list. Time moved on, but the wound never healed. Families quietly moved away. Some marriages in the community strained under the weight of fear and suspicion. Parents warned their daughters not to go anywhere alone. Teachers kept classroom doors locked. What had once been a tight-knit town now carried a shadow, one tied permanently to the memory of Carla Walker. And year after year, the same rumor resurfaced. The killer wasn't a stranger. He was someone local. Someone who knew Fort Worth, knew Benbrook, blended in perfectly, and disappeared back into everyday life after committing the unthinkable. Jim Walker grew up carrying that belief with him. Even as an adult, he never stopped searching. He studied criminal psychology. He trained physically, imagining he might one day confront the man who took his sister. He walked the culvert where Carla was found and tried to understand how such evil could exist in a town that once felt so safe. But for nearly 50 years, there were no answers. Just a grieving family, a haunted community, and a murderer who walked free among them. It would take a discovery no one in 1974 could have imagined, something hidden in Carla's clothing for almost half a century, to finally reveal the truth. In the weeks after Carla Walker was laid to rest, Fort Worth felt like a place frozen in time. People still went to work, children still walked to school, and the church bell still rang on Sundays. But beneath that routine lingered a quiet, constant fear. Everyone knew the man who took Carla was still out there. And worse, many suspected he lived among them. Police continued to scour the city for answers. Detectives from Fort Worth Police Department and Tarrant County reviewed every report from the night of February 16th. They searched for anyone seen around the Brunswick-Ridgelea Bowl between midnight and 1 a.m. They interviewed teen boys who had argued with Rodney earlier that week. They questioned known troublemakers, drifters, and men rumored to have violent tempers. But the case refused to break open. The most painful part was how close they believed they were in the beginning. Carla's purse, found just feet from the car. The magazine clip, dropped during the attack. Rodney's description of the offender, a white male, about 5'10", clean-cut hair, possibly wearing a cowboy hat. There was just enough detail to keep investigators hopeful, but never enough to push the case forward. Rumors spread quickly. Nearly every household on the west side of Fort Worth had a theory. Some believed it had been a passing truck driver. Others insisted the crime was too controlled, too confident, work of someone who knew the area intimately. Women stopped walking alone at night. Teenagers were ordered home before sunset. At the local high school, hallways were quieter. Every girl imagined herself in Carla's place. Every boy feared being blamed for something he didn't do. And in the middle of all of this stood Rodney McCoy, the last person to see Carla alive. He had barely survived the attack himself. His skull was split open with the butt of the pistol, his face bruised and swollen. Yet he woke every morning reliving the moment he saw Carla being pulled from the car. He remembered her voice breaking as she screamed, "Rodney, go get my dad." He remembered the helplessness, the guilt, the shame of surviving when she did not. Investigators hypnotized him, hoping to extract clearer memories. But all it did was bring him deeper into the trauma. He remembered the cowboy hat, the silhouette of the attacker, the sound of the gun failing to fire, 3 hollow clicks that could have ended his life. After each session, Rodney broke down, unable to carry the weight of what he had lived through. Despite everything, Leighton and Doris Walker never blamed him. He stayed in Carla's room for days after the funeral. They let him sleep in her bed, surrounded by her things, because in a strange way, it made it feel like she wasn't fully gone. Rodney became like a son to them, but the community didn't see it that way. Gossip cut deeper than any wound. Rodney felt the judgment every time someone avoided his eyes or whispered in the grocery aisle. Eventually, the pressure became unbearable. After graduation, he left Texas and moved to Alaska, trying to outrun the memories. But the Walker family had no escape. 12-year-old Jim Walker watched everything collapse around him. He watched his mother stare silently into space, gripping Carla's pillow as if it were her daughter's hand. He watched his father take long drives alone, returning with new notes scribbled onto maps, roads he wanted to recheck, people he wanted to interview. In time, Leighton filled a metal box with names, dates, and details of men he considered possible suspects. He wasn't a detective, but he carried himself like one, refusing to let his daughter's case fade. Grief changed Jim. While other boys played football or spent weekends fishing, he wandered the streets near Lake Benbrook, retracing the steps of the officers who had found Carla. Sometimes, he sat inside the culvert where her body was discovered, listening to the echo of dripping water. He told himself he needed to understand how cold it was that night, how dark. He wanted to know what Carla saw, what she felt. He wanted to feel her fear, as if by doing so he could pull some part of the truth closer. He grew into a teenager with a singular obsession, finding the man who killed his sister. The police never stopped searching either. But the investigation began taking strange turns. A year after Carla's death, another young woman, Becky Martin, disappeared from Fort Worth. Her body was later found in a culvert. The similarities were unsettling. 2 girls, 2 culverts, similar time of year, similar ages. Detectives whispered among themselves. Was this the same man? But without forensic tools beyond basic blood typing, they had little to work with. No fingerprints matched anyone. DNA science did not yet exist. The attacker had left almost nothing behind. In the late 1970s, a local man named Jimmy Dean Sasser falsely confessed to killing Carla. His confession unraveled quickly. He knew none of the real details. He admitted later he had lied for attention. Still, the brief hope of closure became another wound for the Walkers to carry. Then, in early 1974, right after Carla's murder, the police had briefly interviewed a man named Glenn Samuel McCurley, a 31-year-old truck driver who happened to own a Ruger pistol that matched the magazine clip found at the crime scene. But when asked to take a polygraph, McCurley passed. He claimed the gun had been stolen. With no evidence to challenge him, detectives crossed him off the list. He returned to his quiet life in Fort Worth, married, 2 children, active in church, and the case continued to rot. As the years passed, Fort Worth changed. New businesses came, older families moved. But Carla's name never disappeared. Her photo hung in police briefings for decades, and her death became the unofficial beginning of a dark chapter in the city, one that included a series of unsolved murders of young women from the 1970s into the 1980s. Strangulations, abductions, dumped bodies, always in the same general region, always with something familiar in the brutality. Detectives debated privately whether a serial offender had stalked their city for years, but no one could prove it. Meanwhile, Jim Walker grew into adulthood with only one goal: to join law enforcement. He believed if he could just get inside the department, if he could gain access to Carla's files, maybe he would see something others had missed. He trained physically, studied criminal psychology at Sam Houston State University, and prepared himself for a career dedicated to justice. But fate intervened. During weapons training at the police academy, Jim noticed something wrong with his eyesight. A doctor diagnosed him with a congenital condition that would gradually take his vision. It ended his dreams of becoming a detective. He was forced to leave the academy, but he did not stop searching. Not for a moment. Through the 1980s and 1990s, new detectives cycled through the cold case files. Some looked into Carla's case, others set it aside, overwhelmed by hundreds of unsolved homicides in Fort Worth. But every few months, Jim called the department and asked if anyone was still working on his sister's case. He wasn't just hoping, he was reminding them she mattered. By the 2000s, Carla's case had become a tragic legend, a reminder of how quickly innocence could vanish. Generations of officers inherited the file, reading the same reports, staring at the same Polaroid images, and wondering how someone could commit such cruelty and then hide in plain sight. In 2019, 45 years after Carla's death, Jim made yet another call. This time, the phone was answered by Detective Leah Wagner, a mother herself, and one of the few investigators in Fort Worth still determined to breathe life into old cases. When Wagner read through the file, she felt something shift inside her. The crime wasn't just horrific, it was personal. The brutality, the youth of the victim, the raw grief of the family. It was the kind of case that gnawed at a mother's heart. She knew she couldn't ignore it. Wagner and her partner, Detective Jeff Bennett, reopened the investigation. They re-examined Carla's preserved clothing. They contacted private DNA labs. They interviewed Rodney again, this time decades after his exile from Fort Worth. And for the first time in years, Jim felt something he hadn't felt since he was 12 years old. Hope. But hope was fragile. The DNA left on Carla's dress and bra was old, almost too degraded to analyze. The sample was tiny, fragile, and dangerous to manipulate. And even if they could get a partial profile, they couldn't yet know if it matched anyone in state or national databases. Wagner knew the risks, but she also knew that the killer had lived free long enough. As she prepared to send Carla's clothing to a specialized forensic lab, a move that could consume the only remaining DNA sample, she understood something Jim had known his entire life. The man who murdered Carla Walker was almost certainly someone from their community. Someone who walked the same roads, shopped at the same stores, lived quietly behind a mask of normalcy, a local man, a familiar man, a man whose face no one ever thought to fear. And soon, after half a century of silence, his name would finally surface. By the time Detective Leah Wagner reopened the Carla Walker case in 2019, nearly everyone who had worked it originally was either retired or gone. The old investigation boxes were worn and yellowing, packed tightly with handwritten reports, Polaroids, interview transcripts, and evidence bags that had not seen daylight in decades. And yet, when Wagner pulled open the lid of the first box, she felt the same weight the original detectives must have felt. An emotional heaviness, the sense that this case was personal even for those who had never met Carla. One by one, she lifted the items from the evidence box: Carla's powder blue dress, her torn undergarments, a small paper envelope containing the Ruger magazine clip, photographs of the culvert off Benbrook Lake where her body was found, and, tucked deep inside, the autopsy notes that had once shattered the Walker family. Most evidence from the 1970s had long since degraded, but Carla's dress had been preserved incredibly well. The Fort Worth Police Department back then had stored her clothing in paper, bags rather than plastic, a decision that unknowingly prevented moisture and bacterial growth from destroying the DNA. For decades, the dress sat untouched, waiting for a moment science wasn't yet capable of offering. Wagner stared at it with a kind of reverence. It didn't feel like a piece of fabric. It felt like a message frozen in time, one that had never been translated. She knew that inside those fibers, in the folds and seams that held Carla's final moments, there might be the one thing investigators never had in 1974, a genetic fingerprint. The technology didn't exist back then. The science wasn't strong enough even in the 1990s. But now, forensic genealogy had changed everything. It was the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer. Wagner wondered if it could finally give Carla Walker what she never received: justice. She contacted Paul Holes, the legendary cold case investigator who had become synonymous with solving the unsolvable. When Holes heard the details, he didn't hesitate. He arranged for Carla's clothing to be shipped to a specialized screening lab he trusted in California, one capable of isolating microscopic traces of DNA. Weeks passed. Jim Walker checked in constantly, though he tried to hide how anxious he was. He had lived most of his life navigating darkness, literally and emotionally, after his vision loss. But he still carried a relentless clarity when it came to Carla. For the first time in decades, that clarity felt sharpened by hope. Finally, the call came. The lab had found something. Not much, but enough. A tiny, fragile biological sample had been recovered from Carla's bra strap, a sliver of male DNA that had somehow survived nearly half a century. Another faint trace was found on her dress. It wasn't enough to generate a full CODIS profile yet, but it was proof the killer had left something behind. Wagner felt her pulse rise. She requested permission to send the sample to a forensic genealogy lab in Houston, Othram Inc., led by CEO David Middleman, one of the few teams capable of working with degraded DNA. Othram specialized in capturing entire genome sequences from fragments most labs would dismiss as unusable. But the risk was enormous. The sample was so small, so fragile, that attempting to sequence it could destroy it forever. If the test failed, Carla's last hope would vanish with it. Wagner brought the dilemma to Jim Walker. She expected hesitation. She expected fear. Instead, Jim answered before she could finish speaking. "She's waited long enough. Do whatever you have to do." It was a green light. In the summer of 2020, Othram processed the sample. Weeks passed with no updates. Each day felt heavier for Jim, who had already survived decades of disappointment. But this time felt different. The science was different. The world was different. And on July 4, 2020, while fireworks echoed across Texas skies, Wagner's phone rang. It was Middleman. His voice was calm, but the words carried a weight that made Wagner go still. Leah. We built a family tree. The last name is McCurley. She froze. Her heart skipped. Her mind went back to a name she had seen just once, buried deep inside the original investigation file. Glenn Samuel McCurley, interviewed in 1974. Owner of a Ruger .22 matching the magazine clip. Dismissed after claiming the gun had been stolen. Cleared because he passed a polygraph. He had been suspect number 22. Wagner immediately pulled the old file from storage. The notes were brief, almost dismissive. The 1970s detectives had questioned him, recorded his story, and then moved on. There was nothing in the file suggesting they ever revisited him. McCurley had simply slipped back into Fort Worth life. Married, 2 sons, church-going, truck driver. Quiet. Unremarkable. Invisible. Just like a predator who learns to blend in. Wagner and Detective Jeff Bennett ran a fresh background check. McCurley was still alive. He was 77 years old, living only a couple miles from the bowling alley where Carla was abducted. His criminal history was minimal, mostly from his teenage years, including stealing cars. Nothing violent on paper. Nothing that would suggest he was capable of torturing and murdering a teenage girl. But the DNA didn't lie. Wagner wanted confirmation before proceeding. She sent an officer to conduct a trash pull outside the McCurley home. The officer retrieved a discarded McDonald's straw. It was sent to the lab. The results returned quickly. The DNA on the straw matched the DNA on Carla Walker's bra strap. For a moment, the world seemed to pause for Wagner. This wasn't just a suspect. This wasn't another dead end. This was the man who had lived free for 46 years, while Carla's family mourned and suffered in silence. The case was now alive. A few days later, Wagner and Bennett drove to the McCurley home. Glenn and his wife, Judy McCurley, welcomed them inside politely. Glenn spoke casually about his past truck-driving jobs. Judy talked about working at the Ridgelea West Baptist Daycare for 32 years. Nothing about the couple seemed unusual. Nothing screamed danger. But Wagner wasn't there for casual conversation. "We're taking you way back," she told him. "Back to 1974 Carla Walker." Judy reacted first. She immediately recognized the name. She remembered where the Walkers lived. She remembered the car left in their driveway for years, untouched, like a shrine to their daughter. Glenn stayed quiet. When Wagner asked for a DNA swab, he hesitated, but then agreed. She watched him sign the consent form, open his mouth, and allow her to collect the sample. She looked directly at him, knowing full well what the results would reveal. 11 days later, the results confirmed what Othram had already shown. Glenn Samuel McCurley's DNA matched the killer's. On September 24, 2020, U.S. Marshals and Fort Worth detectives arrested him. News spread quickly through the Walker family. Jim received the call he had been waiting for since he was 12 years old. "We got him," he cried. He called Rodney McCoy, who broke down on the other end of the line. Rodney whispered, disbelieving, "Got him?" Jim said yes. After 46 years, they finally had him. But justice wasn't complete. Not yet. During interrogation, McCurley claimed he had only approached the car to stop Rodney from hurting Carla. He claimed the rest was consensual, but his version fell apart under questioning. When detectives pressed him about where he left Carla's body, his answers were vague, contradictory. At one point, he even gave the wrong location, suggesting he had forgotten or that there were other victims he was mixing up. Investigators began to suspect something far darker. They believed Carla wasn't his only victim. But even with mounting evidence, even with the truth closing in, McCurley refused to show remorse. He refused to confess fully. He refused to help other families who might have suffered the same fate. For Jim Walker, the moment was bittersweet. He had imagined confronting his sister's killer his whole life. He had imagined feeling rage, satisfaction, closure. But sitting across from the truth, an old man who had lived as if nothing had happened, Jim found something else inside himself. Forgiveness. Not for the murderer, but for the boy he once was. The boy who thought he failed his sister. In August 2021, after 2 days of testimony in his trial, Glenn McCurley suddenly changed his plea to guilty. The courtroom gasped. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. He died behind bars 2 years later. Carla Walker's family, at last, could breathe again. But the most stunning realization still lingered. Her killer had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. A Fort Worth local. A man who lived less than a mile from the Walkers. A man who walked the same streets, attended the same churches, shopped at the same stores. A ghost in human skin. And DNA, silent for 46 years, finally exposed him. By the time Glenn Samuel McCurley was brought into custody on September 21st, 2020, he was a frail 77-year-old man. His walk was slow, his voice raspy. He looked like someone's quiet grandfather, a man who blended into grocery store aisles and church pews without notice. But beneath that ordinary exterior, detectives believed, lived the same predator who had tortured and murdered 17-year-old Carla Jan Walker almost half a century earlier. For Jim Walker, waiting at home, the arrest didn't feel like victory. Not yet. It felt like stepping into a storm he had prepared for his entire life. There was relief, yes, but also fear. Fear that somehow the system would fail again. Fear that the man who took Carla from him would slip through the cracks of justice, just as he had so many years before. But this time, science was stronger than suspicion. DNA had spoken, and there was no hiding from it. In the hours after his arrest, detectives Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett sat across from McCurley in an interrogation room. The walls were plain, the lighting harsh. A camera in the corner captured every twitch of his expression. At first, McCurley behaved like a confused old man who had been inconvenienced. He denied knowing Carla. He denied ever seeing her. He denied being at the bowling alley on February 16th, 1974. But the detectives knew better. The DNA sample collected from Carla's bra strap, something so small it could barely be seen, had matched the swab taken from McCurley's cheek. It was the kind of evidence that did not bend to excuses or memory lapses. It carried the weight of truth. As the hours passed, cracks began to appear in McCurley's composure. He stopped meeting their eyes. His voice shook, and then, in a sudden moment of weakness, he whispered something that sent a chill through the room. Okay. I did do it, I guess. But the confession was twisted, self-serving, designed to minimize his actions. He claimed he had approached the car to help Carla, insisting that Rodney was the aggressor. He claimed he had taken Carla to calm her down. He suggested that what followed was consensual. It was a lie so grotesque, so disconnected from the truth, that Wagner had to fight the urge to end the interview right there. He knew exactly what he had done, and so did she. Still, he refused to reveal details that could link him to other unsolved murders in the area, deaths of young women from the 1970s and 1970s that bore chilling similarities to Carla's case. Detectives pushed him, offering him a chance to bring peace to other families, but he shut down completely. When the interrogation ended, Wagner stepped outside and called Jim Walker. Her voice trembled with emotion. "We have him, Jim. We finally have him." On the other end, Jim closed his eyes and let the words settle into his bones. For the first time since he was 12 years old, he felt the weight begin to lift. But the journey was far from over. In August 2021, the trial of State of Texas versus Glenn Samuel McCurley began in a Tarrant County courtroom. It was one of the most anticipated trials in local memory. Journalists packed the hallways. Former classmates of Carla, now in their 60s, returned to bear witness. And in the front row sat the people who had carried her memory the longest. Jim Walker, his sister Cindy, and the boy who had once loved Carla with all his heart. Rodney McCoy, now an older man with quiet eyes and a lifetime of scars. Rodney had spent decades haunted by suspicion and guilt. Many had whispered that he was involved in Carla's death. Others had blamed him for not fighting harder, for not protecting her. But now, as he stepped into the courtroom, he carried himself with a calm strength. He was finally ready to speak the truth out loud. When he took the stand, the room fell silent. Rodney described the moment the car door opened, the pistol striking his skull, Carla begging the attacker to stop hitting him, and the sound of 3 hollow clicks, the gun failing to fire at point-blank range. As he relived the nightmare, his voice cracked, but he did not break. His testimony was raw, heartbreaking, and undeniable. "You hung a cloud over me for 47 years, Rodney later said, not to the court, but to McCurley, who sat expressionless beside his lawyers. "I survived, but I never lived." Next, retired Detective Jim Minter testified about the original investigation, explaining how limited the tools had been in 1974. He was followed by Wagner and Bennett, who recounted the DNA breakthrough that cracked the case open. They unfolded Carla's powder blue dress in front of the jury, a garment that had survived decades to speak for her when she no longer could. But the most shocking moment came when the prosecutors introduced a piece of evidence no one expected. The .22 Ruger pistol McCurley claimed had been stolen in 1974. It had been found hidden in his home, tucked inside a concealed compartment above a door. The same weapon that dropped the magazine clip at the bowling alley. The same weapon that failed to fire at Rodney. It was the final thread tying him to that night. When the evidence was shown, Jim Walker watched something extraordinary unfold across the courtroom. Members of the McCurley family, people who had walked into court convinced of Glenn's innocence, began to crumble. His son, Roddy McCurley, stared at the weapon as if seeing a stranger's life flash before him. It was a moment that didn't just convict a killer, it shattered a family. Later that day, outside the courtroom, Jim approached Roddy quietly. Roddy stood alone, shaking, tears pooling in his eyes as his world collapsed around him. No one had prepared him for this. No one had warned him that the father he loved, trusted, and admired might have been hiding a monstrous truth. Jim placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke gently. "You're not responsible for the sins of your father," he told him. "This does not belong to you." Roddy broke down, stunned by the compassion from the brother of the girl his own father murdered. They hugged, an act that would become one of the most powerful images of the trial, a symbol of 2 families bound by tragedy, yet refusing to let hate define them. The courtroom was set for a long trial. Witnesses had been lined up, evidence prepared. But on the 3rd day, something unexpected happened. As the judge prepared to call the next witness, McCurley whispered to his attorney. A brief, tense conversation followed. Then the defense approached the bench. Moments later, the judge looked up. Her voice steady but laced with disbelief. "Mr. McCurley requests to change his plea to guilty." The room erupted in whispers. Some gasped. Others cried silently. Rodney's shoulders sagged. Cindy Walker covered her face. Jim closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him like a long-awaited tide. After nearly half a century, Carla Walker's killer finally admitted what he had done. the judge sentenced him to life in prison. He showed no remorse, no apology, no acknowledgement of the devastation he caused. But he would never walk free again. When the hearing ended, the courtroom exhaled collective grief, grief that had been held for decades, locked deep inside people who had stopped believing in justice. But standing in the middle of it all was Jim Walker, not as the broken boy he once was, but as the man who had carried Carla's memory longer than she had lived. As everyone filtered out, Rodney stood beside Jim, the two men embracing with a quiet understanding forged from trauma and endurance. And just when Jim thought his heart couldn't swell any further, Detective Wagner approached with something in her hand. Rodney recognized it instantly. It was the tiny gold promise ring he had given Carla the night she died, a ring he thought had been lost forever in that culvert. After all these years, investigators had found it among evidence that had never been fully cataloged. Rodney held it delicately, like a fragment of a life that could never be restored, but could finally be honored. He wept for Carla, for himself, for the years stolen by fear and blame, for a love cut short. The trial ended, justice was secured, but something deeper had happened inside that courtroom, something that would define the next chapter of this story. Two families once separated by horror now stood side by side, united not by blood, but by grief, truth, and the courage to confront the past. When Glenn Samuel McCurley was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the case of Carla Walker seemed, on the surface, finally over. A guilty plea after 47 years felt like the closing of a wound that had never healed. Yet, for investigators, for the Walker family, and for the community of Fort Worth, a new question began to take shape. One far darker, far heavier than they were prepared for. What if Carla wasn't the only victim? The suspicion didn't arise randomly. It came from patterns. Patterns that seasoned detectives recognized the moment they revisited old case files. Between 1967 and 1985, Fort Worth and surrounding counties saw a chilling rise in murders of young women. Many were strangled. Many were abducted. Many were left in drainage areas, creek beds, or culverts, just like Carla. And most importantly, almost all of those cases remained unsolved. After McCurley's arrest, investigators quietly formed a review committee to reopen a cluster of cold cases from the 1970s and 1980s. They combed through autopsy reports, old photos, missing persons files, and handwritten notes, nearly too faded to decipher. And again, disturbing similarities emerged. There was Becky Martin, who vanished a year before Carla and was found in a culvert just outside the city limits. There was June Ward, discovered in 1977, with signs of being beaten and strangled. There was Denise Hogue, found near a creek bridge in similarly brutal condition. There was Christy Tower, bound with electrical wire and left in a field north of the city. There were others, too. Young, vulnerable, their final moments eerily familiar. Detectives did not publicly link these cases to McCurley, but behind closed doors, the conversation persisted. He didn't suddenly wake up at age 31 and commit one murder, a retired investigator remarked quietly. Predators escalate. Predators practice. And there was another unsettling detail. McCurley had lived within miles of nearly every crime scene. He had worked as a long-haul and regional truck driver, often traveling through rural zones, industrial lots, and isolated roads. His work would have provided mobility, knowledge of remote hiding spots, and the ability to disappear for long stretches without drawing suspicion. The more investigators looked, the more they realized how perfectly his lifestyle aligned with the unsolved murders. But perhaps the most telling evidence wasn't physical at all. It was silence. During interrogation, when Wagner and Bennett gently pushed McCurley about other possible victims, women found under similar circumstances, his demeanor changed. He recoiled, his face hardened, his breathing shifted. It was as if mentioning those names stirred a dormant part of him, something he had buried so deep that even acknowledging it would unravel the carefully crafted persona he had built over decades. At one point, when asked about the culvert where Carla was found, he gave detectives directions to the wrong location. It wasn't a mistake. It was something else, something investigators recognized in offenders who carried multiple secrets. The inability to recall exact crime scenes often meant the memories blended together. Too many victims, too many hiding places, a blur of violence repeating itself. When family members of the other murdered women learned of the DNA breakthrough in Carla's case, many reached out to the Fort Worth Police Department, some after decades of silence. They asked questions they were almost afraid to speak aloud. Could he have taken my daughter? Could he have been the one? Was she one of his? Police could not give them answers. Not yet. But as Jim Walker listened to their voices, voices filled with the same grief he had carried since age 12, he realized that justice for Carla might become a path for justice for others, too. In interviews, he spoke softly about those families. There are other Carla Walkers out there, he said. Other parents who went to their graves never knowing. If what happened to my sister can help them, then that's where our purpose goes next. While investigators quietly re-examined old files, the Walker family began confronting the emotional aftermath of the trial. Jim, in particular, felt the weight of a transformation he didn't expect. For most of his life, rage had been his engine. He had trained his body in case he ever faced the man who took Carla. He had imagined confronting him, hurting him, making him feel even a fraction of the terror Carla felt. But now that the moment had come and gone, Jim found himself searching for something deeper. Peace. He spoke openly about this in later interviews, explaining how finally understanding the truth allowed him to shift his purpose. He no longer saw himself as a boy frozen in trauma, but as a survivor who wanted to help others find answers. The trauma would never leave him, but it no longer controlled him. In the months after the trial, an unexpected bond developed between Jim Walker and Roddy McCurley, the killer's son. Roddy had been devastated by the revelations. He had believed his father was a good man, a godly man, a man who tucked him into bed, took him to church, and provided for his family. Accepting that his father was capable of such cruelty shattered his identity. Jim recognized that pain. He had lived inside it for decades. So instead of turning away, he extended compassion. Roddy later said, "Jim gave me something I didn't know I needed, permission to heal." Their unlikely friendship became a symbol, not of forgiveness for Glenn, but of breaking generational harm. Roddy was a victim too, a survivor of a kind of betrayal few can understand. Meanwhile, Detective Leah Wagner continued to push for change on a broader level. She collaborated with lawmakers and forensic leaders to draft new legislative proposals supporting advanced genetic genealogy. The most significant of these efforts became known as the Carla Walker Act, a federal initiative designed to fund DNA testing, improve forensic technology access, and help law enforcement solve cold cases that had stalled due to limited resources. The timing was critical. Across the nation, police agencies were drowning in unsolved homicides, cases with fibers, hair, bloodstains, and clothing preserved for decades, but never tested or revisited. DNA genealogy offered a lifeline, but the cost was high. Many departments simply couldn't afford the advanced technology that had finally identified Carla's killer. The Carla Walker Act aimed to change that. Jim supported it wholeheartedly. He traveled, spoke at events, and met with families from across the country who, like him, had lived too long without answers. His message was always the same. If science can speak for my sister after 46 years, it can speak for yours too. In 2023, while work on the act continued, Glenn McCurley died in prison at age 80. There was no headline fanfare, no grand announcement, just a quiet notification that the man who haunted generations was gone. Jim felt no triumph at the news. Instead, he felt a solemn sense of finality. He met his justice here, he said, and he'll meet the rest elsewhere. But the truth was this: McCurley's death didn't close the book. It opened new chapters for families who had been waiting since the 1970s and 1980s to know if their daughters, sisters, and mothers were among his victims. Investigators continued their work behind the scenes, comparing DNA, reviewing case similarities, and applying new forensic tools to old wounds. One day, answers might come. One day, closure might spread beyond Carla's case. One day, the full truth of Glenn McCurley's past might finally surface. But for now, what Fort Worth carried was something more powerful than fear, a sense of unity born from truth. A town had faced its darkest memory. A family had reclaimed their daughter's story. A brother had fulfilled a promise he made as a boy. A survivor, Rodney, had finally been exonerated in the eyes of the community. And the technology that caught Carla's killer was now being used to bring light into other forgotten cases. Carla Walker's life had been stolen in 1974. Her story had been buried. Her voice had been silenced. But through DNA, through persistence, through the unbreakable devotion of those who loved her, Carla had become something larger, a symbol for justice, for change, and for the countless families still waiting in the shadows. And as Jim Walker often said, we never gave up on her. And now, she's helping us bring others home. In the years following Glenn Samuel McCurley's conviction and eventual death in prison, the town of Fort Worth quietly transformed. It didn't happen overnight. Trauma rarely fades quickly. But piece by piece, the community began lifting a weight it had carried for nearly half a century, a weight named Carla Walker. For those who lived through the 1970s, Carla's murder wasn't just a crime. It was a turning point. Parents stopped letting their children walk home alone. Couples drove with their doors locked. Teens avoided empty parking lots, especially after school dances. For decades, the town lived with the invisible imprint of one monster hiding in plain sight. But as new forensic technologies emerged and the Carla Walker Act gained national attention, something else began happening. Families across the country returned to their police stations with new hope. Evidence long sealed in dusty envelopes was retested. Clothing preserved for sentimental reasons became critical forensic goldmines. Old crime scenes were re-examined with new eyes. Carla's story, once a local tragedy, became a symbol of possibility. Detective Leah Wagner began lecturing at law enforcement conferences, explaining how a 5-nanogram DNA sample on Carla's bra, something considered unusable for decades, had cracked open a 46-year-old mystery. She carried Carla's photo with her everywhere she spoke, not because she needed it for presentation, but because the photo reminded her why she refused to stop pushing. Wagner often described the moment the lab called with the confirmation. "Everything around me went quiet," she said. "You wait your whole career for a moment like that." She also talked about Jim Walker, how his persistence, his refusal to let the case die, became the heartbeat of the entire investigation. "Cold cases don't solve themselves," she said. "Families solve them. People who refuse to stop calling, writing, asking. Jim Walker kept that file alive." Jim listened humbly whenever he heard her say that. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a brother, trying to honor the girl he lost at 12 years old. A girl who laughed loudly, walked fast, dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, and loved animals so fiercely that her room was covered in posters of horses, puppies, and birds. He still remembered the sound of her heels on the wooden hallway, the smell of the hairspray she used before school, the way she teased him whenever he tried to sneak cookies before dinner. Those memories stayed sharper than anything else in his life, even as his eyesight faded. And yet, what surprised Jim the most was how Carla's story continued to grow long after her case was solved. There were vigils, scholarships, memorial events at Western Hills High School. Former classmates, now in their 60s, spoke about her during alumni gatherings. Some cried, still unable to understand how something so horrific could happen to someone so gentle. But perhaps the most unexpected moment came the day Jim was invited to speak to lawmakers in Washington about the Carla Walker Act. He stood at the podium, hands shaking slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of what he was about to say. "My sister's life was taken by a man who hid behind normalcy," he said. "He blended in. He went to church. He raised children. He walked among us. And because science couldn't give us answers in 1974, my parents died, without knowing the truth. We can't let that happen to more families, not when we finally have the tools that can give them peace." Some lawmakers wiped tears from their eyes. Others nodded quietly. All understood the power of what Jim was saying. Because this wasn't just about Carla. It was about every case forgotten in the back rooms of police stations. Every mother who died, wondering what happened to her daughter. Every father who blamed himself for something he could never have prevented. Every sibling who grew up, haunted by questions that had no answers. Jim carried all of them in his voice. Back home in Fort Worth, another story unfolded. One that spoke to the unexpected ripple effect of justice. Rodney McCoy, Carla's high school sweetheart, had avoided the city for decades. Too many people blamed him for what happened, even though he had fought for Carla's life and nearly died that night. He had carried that guilt for years, moving to Alaska, working remote jobs, burying himself in long shifts to avoid thinking about the girl he loved and lost. But when McCurley was arrested, Jim reached out to Rodney with a single message. "We got him, buddy," Rodney cried when he heard the words. Not because justice had been served, but because someone finally, after 46 long years, understood that he had been a victim too. For the first time since he was 18, the weight lifted from his chest. He eventually returned to Fort Worth, not to reclaim the past, but to reclaim the truth about who he was that night. He spoke during a memorial event, voice breaking as he described kneeling beside Carla's casket and noticing the promise ring missing from her finger. "That was the moment I lost her," he said, "and it never left me." Wagner later surprised him by returning that ring, found among evidence from the culvert. Rodney held it for a long time, letting his tears fall freely. It was the smallest piece of metal, yet to him, it felt like a piece of Carla's heart returned. Meanwhile, the man responsible, Glenn McCurley, left behind a twisted legacy. After his death, investigators continued digging into his past. They learned he had once worked near several locations where other victims were found. They learned he drove routes that overlapped with disappearing women. They learned his access to remote areas made him nearly invisible to patrol officers. But no matter how much they uncovered, one truth remained. He took his secrets with him. When reporters asked Jim how he felt about McCurley's death, he answered simply, "Justice didn't end with him. Justice began with the truth." In time, Jim developed something he never expected, a friendship with Roddy McCurley, Glenn's son. Roddy had grown up believing his father was a good man. Then, at age 57, he learned he was the son of a predator. The guilt and confusion nearly broke him. Jim recognized that look on his face, the hollow, shaken stare of someone whose entire identity shifted overnight. "You're not responsible for the sins of your father," Jim told him. You don't carry his darkness." Those words changed Roddy's life. Months later, at a community event, Roddy spoke publicly. "I lost my father twice," he said. "The first time when he chose to hurt Carla, the second time when I learned who he really was. But then I met Jim, and he showed me that light can come from the darkest places." Stories like that began circulating across Texas. Stories of unity born from tragedy, of families supporting each other across unimaginable divides. And in those stories, Carla lived on. Not as a victim, not as a headline, but as a catalyst for justice. Her case paved the way for new investigative methods. Her name inspired legislation that would help solve thousands of cold cases nationwide. Her story connected people, survivors, detectives, lawmakers, and even relatives of the killer, into a shared mission of truth. By the time the 50th anniversary of her death approached, Fort Worth prepared a memorial unlike any before. Former classmates returned. Investigators stood alongside citizens. Parents held their children a little closer. Candles lined the sidewalk outside the old bowling alley, now long renovated, but still holding the weight of history. Jim stood before the crowd, older now, his vision dim, but his voice unwavering. For years, Carla was a ghost in this town, but she isn't a ghost anymore. She's the reason cold cases are being solved. She's the reason new laws exist. She's the reason people who lost hope now believe again. What happened to her was pure evil. But what came from her story has been pure light. He paused, feeling the wind shift, imagining Carla's presence the way he always had, as a warmth on the back of his neck, a reminder that she never truly left. "We didn't get to watch her graduate," he said softly. "We didn't get to see her become a veterinarian or start a family. But she still changed the world. And that's a legacy no darkness can take." The crowd fell silent. Not the silence of grief, but the silence of understanding. Carla Walker's story had ended in 1974. But her impact, her echo, her light would continue long after every person present had left this earth. Justice doesn't erase tragedy. Justice doesn't heal every wound. But justice brings truth, and truth brings peace. In the end, that was Carla's final gift.